So the campaign for the NDIS, I guess it was really predicated on lots of other campaigns that had already been done beforehand. So there was a lot of campaigns about unmet need, but I think the main difference between our campaign and the previous ones were that we brought all three parts of the disability sector together. So people with disabilities and their peak disability organisations, service providers and the peak service provider bodies, and families and carers and the peak family and carer bodies. I think the other main difference is that previous campaigns around unmet need had tended to be done by one group or another, were a bit disjointed and focused too much on what the problem was rather than what the solution was. The other thing was that there was a bit of right people at the right time. Having somebody who was in government, who was a politician, who listened to the experiences, listened to the ideas and said, yeah, that's a really good idea. You should get united and do it. And he was someone who was from the union movement. And so that whole idea of a united voice and the organising principle coming from the grassroots, he pushed the disability sector to actually say, well, if you want to do it, you need to show us that you really want to do it. Galvanising people to be able to tell their story to the rest of the community, to the politicians, and all of us having the same ask. So having that clear message of a vision that we were aiming for, not getting bogged down in the detail at that point of the campaign. And we know that, that's one of the tensions, that is the scheme that we've asked for going to in detail actually look like what we want. But in terms of getting something up and happening, we actually had to have a broader vision that was going to galvanise us as a united voice, because if we got too much into detail, that's when the division would start. One of the things I think the campaign did really well was having specific goals as part of the campaign. So specific goals of, the first goal was getting politicians to commit to the actual change, getting politicians to commit to the scheme. The second goal was making, at budget time, having a specific campaign point and campaign actions at budget time for funding the campaign. A specific campaign action when there was legislation going to happen. And each stage of the campaign had people with disabilities and families directly connecting with their local politicians, getting photos with them, with the T-shirts, with the paraphernalia, with the things saying I count, and then social media, Facebook, websites, local community newspapers, using all of those sorts of tools and resources so that the politicians, number one, they were hearing it from the people who actually it was going to make a difference to, and number two, it was then public that they're in a photo with the person with the disability and their family member saying, yes, I support this and yes, I'm committed to this. So it makes it very hard for them to back down. Asking for a national disability insurance scheme was one thing, but what does that mean? And so I sort of felt that the three clear messages were that people wanted certainty of funding, sustainability of funding, so they didn't want to be, it's only those people with the loudest voice and the worst story that get funded. They were sick of being on that feeling that every year you're waiting to see whether your funding is going to continue or not. So that certainty of funding was really important, the certainty of getting support, and then that it was individualised and personalised and that you were in control of it. A lot of people weren't too fussed about the detail of what a national disability insurance scheme might look like. That was where some of the tensions were with advocacy groups and people with disability who are activists, sort of like what's the role of the campaign versus what's the role of the advocacy sector more generally. So the role of the campaign was very much about getting the broader community and the politicians on board The role of the advocacy sector and disability organisations was more about, okay, now we've got to look at what's the detail that we're asking for when we're dealing with the bureaucrats and the design elements and as we move it forward. And so sometimes there was a tension there because advocacy groups felt that the message was too simple and, how are we getting that discussion happening about what it's really going to look like. But when you're trying to get, this was a hard tension because I do understand that when you're trying to get the general community who don't have any idea of what our world is like, getting them to support and understand and see this as something that government should see as a priority was really important. And I think that made a big difference to the success of the campaign. So the campaign goals had the targets of the specific targeting of politicians at those certain points in time, but there were also specific things to try and garner the general population's acceptance and support of the scheme as well. And that was where some of the ways that was done caused some tension. So one of the ways that the campaign used was doing what they called a disability. So having a afternoon tea, morning tea, or whatever you might want to do that you could call it, inviting your local politician and inviting members of your local community. So trying to get it away from being a disability service provider thing or a disability group thing, but actually getting the general community on board. The other thing that really helped with that was having some of the coordinators for the campaign were actually journalists or ex-journalists. One of the other key things which I think is really important with the messaging was the slogan, "Every Australian Counts." So when we first were discussing about, how do we brand the campaign, the NDIS is not really a brand that, gives you any idea of what it's about. And we knew what our messages were, but then how do you actually get the general community to understand what that means? So a really interesting thing from those discussions were a lot of the disability sector were sort of talking about, it's an insurance scheme. It's about making sure that if anyone can have a disability for an accident, for genetic, degenerative, it's something that could happen to anybody. So having an insurance scheme makes sense. But the focus group said that message doesn't work. That message is too negative. It's focusing on people's mortality. It's focusing on all the things which actually contribute to the othering of disability. What worked was people thinking about everyone in society should have the opportunity to be able to do what everyone, be able to participate, be able to be included, be able to have a fair go. The Australian values of, mateship and helping other people out because we all should be helping each other out and everyone having a fair go. That message actually worked. So that's why Every Australian Counts was the slogan that was, in the end, what we came up with. We know, as advocates, we know that this is not something which you've campaigned for and that's it, it's done. There has to be ongoing campaigning to keep it or to move it even towards the vision that we want it to be, because it's not there yet.